I don't think anybody had any idea that Zelenskyy would be so impertinent, so disrespectful, so insulting to the United States of America. Look, this is one of the great moments in the history of American diplomacy. The way that President Trump and J.D. Vance stood up for American interests on the world stage, the way that President Trump defended Americans after years of being fleeced and abused and taken advantage of and taken for granted, millions of American hearts swelled with overflowing pride today to watch President Trump put Zelenskyy in his place. The only reason that Zelenskyy has a country, that Zelenskyy is in power, is because of the United States. Americans have suffered economically, funding this war now for years. American security has been degraded, our stockpiles depleted, our ability to project power in other regions of the world negatively affected to protect and defend Ukraine. Americans probably don't even know the true extent of just how much military support on multiple levels and fronts America has provided to Ukraine. And then this man shows up in the Oval Office and lectures us, says we have to do more, says we're not as good as Europe, says that we need to provide them a forever war guarantee, fight Russia till the end of time. No American watching that today says they want to send their sons and daughters to die on behalf of Zelenskyy. And President Trump was clear and firm and principled, saying either you're our partner for peace in ending this war, or we can't work with you. And Zelenskyy, for the first time since this has begun, finally met a Western leader willing to assert their own interests, the interests of their own country, and not bow down to and venerate this man as a messianic figure.
Boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. So we have to continue our coverage of the historic fallout that happened in the White House between President Donald Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who, for whatever reason, thought it was a good idea to walk into the White House and to openly disrespect the President of the United States while he has his hands out begging for the United States to continue to give more funding to Ukraine to fight a war that, quite honestly, I just don't think realistically they can win against Russia. Okay, Zelenskyy was expected to come into the White House to sign the minerals deal that would essentially help the United States get paid back for all the money that we paid to help Ukraine fight this war that, again, I really don't think they can win. But Zelenskyy decided, no, he's not going to do that, right? I don't think he had any intentions of really doing that. He walked in, he showed his ass, and he got kicked out. Now, Zelenskyy is running to Europe, okay? Because the Europeans are also as delusional as Volodymyr Zelenskyy in the sense that they believe that they could actually fight the Russians and that they stand a chance. And that's all fine and good, right? If that's what they want to do, okay? But apparently, the Prime Minister of the UK, Mr. Keir Starmer, has announced a framework for a peace plan that would include the UK stepping up, okay? They would contribute more money to help Ukraine in the military. And they also said they'd be willing to put boots on the ground if need be. Now, again, good luck getting the UK military to fight on behalf of Ukraine. I'm not sure if they actually have the ability to stomach that. But hey, this is what they're saying, okay? Because, again, they're hell-bent on not allowing Russia to, quote-unquote, win, right? So, yeah, the problem, though, with this deal is that they still need the United States in order to enforce it. That's the hilarious part about it.
First, we will keep the military aid flowing and keep increasing the economic pressure on Russia to strengthen Ukraine now. Second, we agreed that any lasting peace must ensure Ukraine's sovereignty and security, and Ukraine must be at the table. Third, in the event of a peace deal, we will keep boosting Ukraine's own defensive capabilities to deter any future invasion. Fourth, we will go further to develop a coalition of the willing to defend a deal in Ukraine and to guarantee the peace. Not every nation will feel able to contribute, but that can't mean that we sit back. Instead, those willing will intensify planning now with real urgency. The UK is prepared to back this with boots on the ground and planes in the air together with others, Europe must do the heavy lifting. But to support peace in our continent and to succeed, this effort must have strong US backing.
Now, why do I find this so hilarious? The reason why is because before I do these videos, right, I do a whole lot of research to get the context of what everybody's saying about this situation before I do the video. So I just kind of understand the overall broader context, okay? The reason why I'm laughing is because you openly have the Democrats and the liberal media and the neocons rooting against America, right? They're rooting for Europe, okay? They're rooting for everybody else except us because they hate Trump. And it's just funny because ultimately, Europe can't do anything. Ukraine can't do anything without the United States of America, right? So even if the Europeans decided, hey, you know what, we got to go at this alone, right? They still have to come back to the United States and say, hey, can you help us go at this alone? So you can't, right? You can't. And the reason why you can't is because your nation is weak, right? The Europeans, let's be real, in the grand scheme of things, they're weak. So you got a bunch of weak nations trying to boss around and tell stronger nations like Russia and the United States what to do, right? I just find it hilarious, okay? So again, they desperately want a seat at the table, right? They desperately want to say, even though they don't really have the power. And I just find all this to be fascinating stuff. And what I find to be even more fascinating is the reaction from the liberal media, okay? The reflexive hatred for President Trump for looking out for America's best interest, okay? Instead of putting Europe's interest over our interest, right? And again, that is what really bothers me about the media is that they're now essentially taking the side of foreign nations over the United States of America because Trump is in office. It just shows you how treasonous these individuals are. So with that being said, let's react to this interview between Marco Rubio and George Stephanopoulos, in which Marco Rubio is going to go off on George Stephanopoulos, boohoo, whining, crying about President Trump kicking Volodymyr Zelenskyy out of the White House. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Bringing the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us this morning. Has there been any contact with President Zelenskyy since Friday?
Well, I haven't had any contact with him since Friday. We have plenty of contacts with him, though. Plenty. I mean, he met in the last 10 days. He's met with the Secretary of Commerce. He spoke to the president on the phone, met with the Secretary of Commerce, met with me, met with the Vice President, met with our special envoy, and then was invited and came over on, well, invited, you know, he wanted to come over on Friday to sign this commercial deal. It didn't happen. So there's been plenty of contact with them. I've talked to the foreign minister several times, not since then. And we'll see moving forward. I think the last line in the president's Truth Social post is the one to focus in on, and that is, we'll be ready to re-engage when they're ready to make peace, which is clearly what the president's goal is here. He's trying to get Russia to the table to bring about, to see if there's a way to bring about an end to this conflict. That's his goal. That's his only goal. That's his centralized focus. And, you know, hopefully we'll get to a point where that's possible.
The British Prime Minister said this morning that the United Kingdom and France are working on a peace plan with Ukraine to present to the U.S. Do you know where things stand with that plan?
No, I mean, I've talked to both of the foreign ministers of France and the UK yesterday, and I explained to them sort of the events leading up to what you saw on Friday. Look, I think what's really important here is to understand the dynamic. The president is basically saying there's this horrible war. It's been going on for 3 years. It is a bloody stalemate, a meat grinder type war, and he wants it to end. How does it end? It's very simple. The only way it ends is if Vladimir Putin comes to a negotiating table. And right now, President Trump is the only person on earth who has any chance whatsoever of bringing him to a table to see what it is he would be willing to end the war on. Now, maybe their claims or what they want, their demands will be unreasonable. We don't know, but we have to bring him to the table. You're not going to bring him to the table if you're calling him names, if you're being antagonistic. That's just the president's instincts from years and years and years of putting together deals as someone who's in business. And that's the only goal here.
Let me just stop you there for 1 second.
Why is it a war with no end in sight?
Why is it okay to call President Zelenskyy Why is it okay to call President Zelenskyy a dictator, but not, as you say, call Vladimir Putin names?
What a stupid ass question, right? And it just shows you how our media is so hell bent on pushing propaganda. Well, the reason why is simple, okay, is because Zelenskyy is the weakling, right? In this situation between the three parties here, right, four parties really, Europe, Ukraine, Russia, and the United States of America. And what I mean by Europe is the EU plus the UK, because the UK is not a part of the EU anymore. Ukraine is not a part of the EU. So when I say Europe, I really just mean the EU plus the UK, just so that nobody is confused when it comes to what I mean by the Europeans. The Europeans are weak and the Ukrainians are weaker, right? So again, when you're the weak party involved and you don't want to capitulate to a deal in which you are dependent on the stronger party, okay, for the survival of your country, then yes, we're in a position where we can start to make claims about, you being a dictator, which, by the way, Ukraine isn't exactly a democracy. So I'm not sure if that label is inaccurate, but it's simple because of leverage. Volodymyr Zelenskyy doesn't have leverage, right? Putin, on the other hand, considering how he is the stronger individual, right, in this situation, yeah, he does have the leverage. And what you don't want to do is that you don't want to piss off the guy that, you're trying to stop from invading your country and potentially taking over your country, right? That is nuclear armed, right? But again, what I find to be so fascinating about this is that the American media, they want to go out of their way to just, denigrate Putin and to call Putin names and stuff like that. And I'm not saying Putin's a great guy, right? I'm not saying that Putin's a good guy. But in the historical context of the Russian/Soviet leaders of the past, Vladimir Putin is not nearly as ruthless as a Lenin or a Joseph Stalin, right? Like, I don't think that Putin is that guy, right? I don't think he is the guy that the Western media makes him out to be. And I'm not saying he's a good guy, but if he was as ruthless as past Soviet leaders, I think that Ukraine would have been done by now, right? I think that Zelenskyy, I think there'd be questions about whether or not he would still be alive if Putin actually was as ruthless and is as bad of a guy as these people are making him out to be. Again, I'm not saying he's a good guy. I'm just saying in the historical context of past Soviet leaders, I just don't think Putin is that guy, right? Ultimately, at the day, I think if anything, and I know a lot of people in the comment section will disagree with me when I say this, I think that this conflict has revealed that Putin is, in Russia, they're not as strong as we thought they were. And also on top of that, it seems Putin is kind of naive, right, when it comes to dealing with the West, right? I mean, we talked about the conversation that Putin had with Tucker Carlson, in which he basically admitted that, hey, right, at one point we wanted to be a part of NATO, but the United States said, nah, we're good. We'd rather point missiles at you instead, right, and antagonize you, okay? So again, I think Putin low-key is naive, but also I think a part of Putin, he doesn't like being alienated from Europe, right? He wants to be a part of Europe. Western Russia is European. I mean, if you look at the history of Western Russia, they adopted Christianity from the Byzantine Empire, which basically linked them to the traditions of Europe. Russia, back between the 1700s and 1900s, they were known as the quote-unquote Third Rome, right? That's how they saw themselves. A continuation of European and Byzantine culture, okay? So again, you got to look at the broader historical context of what's going on here. And I think that's what the mainstream liberal media is missing, because they believe that the American people are dumb.
Listen, we've spent 3 years calling Vladimir Putin names. That's not the point. The point that we're at now is we're trying to get the man to a table, the Russians. And I've said from the very beginning, maybe they don't want a deal either. We don't know. But we haven't talked to them in 3 years. But maybe they do. The point is, do we want to make... I would ask everybody this. If there are no negotiations, what is the alternative? Another 4 years of war, another 3 years of war, in which the United States and Europe continues to pour billions of dollars into a war in Ukraine? Is that the alternative? I've asked every foreign minister I meet with, tell me your idea of how this turns out. Most don't have a plan. A few have said, well, let's give them another year of fighting. A year from now, a year later, after another year of death, another year of destruction, then maybe Putin will be ready to negotiate at that point.
And another $100 billion in U.S. aid, right? Again, that's what really bothers me about these Europeans, okay? They, like Marco Rubio is pointing out, they don't have a real plan to end the conflict or to quote-unquote win, right? Which for them would be for Russia to give up the territories that they have basically annexed, including Crimea, which is definitely not going to happen, and for Ukraine to join NATO, which definitely also is probably not going to happen as well either, okay? And one of the reasons why that's not going to happen is because, again, that is a threat to Russia's national security, okay? It'd be like if the Russians tried to put missiles in, I don't know, Cuba, right? How do you think that the United States would react to that? Oh, wait, we know, right? Because back in the 60s, that's exactly what they tried to do. And we almost went into a nuclear war over it.
That doesn't sound like a good plan to me, and it certainly is not a plan the president's on board with.
It's not just about getting people to the table. It's about keeping agreements that are made. And that was one of the points that President Zelenskyy was making in the Oval Office on Friday, is that Vladimir Putin has not kept the agreements that were made in the past. Wasn't he right about that?
But what is moving forward is the question, not the past. No one here is claiming Vladimir Putin is going to get the Nobel Peace Prize this year, or that he should be the man of the year of the Humanitarian Association. What we're arguing here is he has a very large country. They're in full war footing. They're cranking out weapons now at a war footing pace. And we need to figure out, is there a way to get them to stop the war? And the only way you're going to do that is to get Russians engaged in negotiations, something the Europeans haven't been able to do, the Biden administration wasn't able to do or didn't even try. That's the goal here. It's that simple. Can we try to sit with them and figure out whether there's anything, what are the Russians' demands? Under what conditions would the Russians be willing to stop this war? And as I said, we don't know what those are because we haven't talked to them in 3 years. That's the singular goal here, is to try to bring about an end to this conflict, and it begins by getting them to the table. Ultimately, like any truce, like any peace agreement anywhere in the world, those things will have to be enforced, they'll have to be enduring, there'll have to be safeguards put in place. Everybody understands that. But it begins with the first step, and that is engaging them to see if it's even possible. Because if it's not possible, then what we're looking at is a protracted stalemate with thousands of people dying, billions of dollars pouring in, and more death and destruction. And that's not something the president wants to be a part of. He's made it very clear.
And furthermore, I would add, when you talk about, who's keeping their promise and who's not keeping their promise, I mean, both sides accuse each other of violating the Minsk agreements, 1 and 2. But I would say, again, the broader context here is the expansion of NATO. Okay. I mean, in the 90s, there are claims that James Baker, the then Secretary of State, told Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, before their collapse, that, hey, we wouldn't be expanding eastward, right, when it comes to NATO. However, allegedly, that only referred to NATO military presence in East Germany. But regardless, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, which, the reason why we had NATO in the first place was to combat the Soviet Union, NATO has expanded eastward, right? And they've continued to expand. And, to Russia, they see that as a national security threat, right? And ultimately, I think that is the real issue here. It's about NATO and their expansion, along with the neutrality of Ukraine. I think that is the crux of the issue here moving forward. When you talk about stopping Russia from doing this moving forward into the future, right? Stopping Russian aggression. Well, again, if you stop expanding NATO and if you keep Ukraine neutral, it is less likely that Russia will feel the need to expand resources and to sacrifice lives, okay, in order to continue to try to expand westward, right? Which, the politicians swear up and down that that's what Putin is trying to do, right? He wants to recreate the Soviet Union. Now, I definitely think Putin wants to influence the Baltic states, Eastern Europe. I definitely think he wants that influence. But in regards to outward, military expansion and acquiring direct and complete control over those territories again, I just think that it's very unrealistic that Putin would actually do that. But again, the politicians swear up and down that he wants to do that no matter what. I'm just saying he's struggling to do that if that's really the goal, just evidenced by, again, what's happening in Ukraine, okay?
Aren't those talks feasible only if the United States is willing to also provide security guarantees to Ukraine? That was the point that President Zelenskyy was also making in the Oval Office.
Well, the security guarantees, which I actually like to call deterrence of is all contingent upon there being a peace. Everybody's saying security guarantees to secure the peace. You first have to have a peace. We don't even know if the peace is possible. And this was understood by the Ukrainians. It was explained to them repeatedly. And that is, here's our strategy. We're trying to get Putin to a negotiating table. Let's not everyone knows the history here, the back and forth. We understand that. We all understand that. But the question now is, can we get them to a table to negotiate? That's our goal. Don't do anything to disrupt that. And that's what Zelenskyy did, unfortunately, is he found every opportunity to try to Ukraine-splain on every issue. Then he confronts the vice president. When the vice president says, the goal here is diplomacy, he immediately jumps in and challenges the vice president. Well, what kind of diplomacy? So we all understand, okay, that Putin is not going to be an easy negotiator in this regard. We all get that. But we have to start the process to see if something is even possible. And I honestly am puzzled. I just don't understand. The Biden administration berated Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israelis, put all kinds of conditions and pressure on them to try to get a ceasefire. In this particular case, we've been nice by comparison. And all we're trying to do here is figure out whether a peace is possible. All these other things that people keep bringing up, that'll have to be a part of a negotiation. Right now, there is no negotiation. Shouldn't we at least try to see if there is a way to end this war in a way that's acceptable to both sides and is enduring and sustainable? How is that a bad thing? I really am puzzled why anyone thinks that trying to be a peacemaker is a bad thing. It's only a bad thing when it's Donald Trump trying to do it. When it's President Trump, it's absurd to me.
Yeah, I mean, it is absurd, okay? When you talk about security assurances, what they're really talking about is NATO expansion, right? That's what they're really talking about. Which again is it's a no-go, right? It's going to be a no-go. But the closest thing that Zelenskyy is going to get to so-called security assurances is the minerals deal, right, that he was supposed to sign. Because if the United States now has a vested financial interest, we're talking about, what, $500 billion here, right, in minerals in Ukraine, then that de facto kind of incentivizes us to defend Ukraine and to make sure that Russia is not too aggressive with Ukraine, right? That is kind of what that is, right? That's kind of the whole point, which I think is something that Zelenskyy is missing, right? Even Putin kind of acknowledged that, hey, you know, we'd much rather work with the United States on a minerals deal than to have the United States work with Ukraine on a minerals deal. Well, why did Putin say that? Well, Putin said that because ultimately for him, again, that minerals deal, if United States gets access to Ukraine's resources, again, it incentivizes the United States to protect Ukraine, right? To essentially defend Ukraine from Russian aggression, right? So, again, that's the closest they're going to get to that.
Well, even some of your Republican allies are puzzled by the steps that President Trump has taken to placate Vladimir Putin. I want to bring up a post that Lisa Murkowski.
Well, which ones? What steps has the president taken to placate?
Let me show you. Let me show you what.
Are we arming the Russians? Are we providing economic assistance to the Russians? Have we given the Russians $180 billion?
Please let me ask you the question. This is Lisa Murkowski, and here's what she says. This week started with administration officials refusing to acknowledge that Russia started the war in Ukraine. It ends with a tense and shocking conversation in the Oval Office and whispers from the White House that they may try to end all U.S. support for Ukraine. I know foreign policy is not for the faint of heart, but right now I am sick to my stomach as the administration appears to be walking away from our allies and embracing Putin, a threat to democracy and U.S. values around the world. Those are not my words. That's Senator Lisa Murkowski. What's your response?
Well, you know, yeah, we're a free country. People have a right to these opinions. I would just say to you, what have we done to placate the Russians? The only thing we've done is say, are you guys willing to talk about peace? I say the same point. We're not giving that. We haven't given.
You voted with North Korea and Russia and you voted with North Korea and Russia and Belarus in the United Nations and against our Western allies.
No, let me tell you. All right. So you know what do you know what the United Nations resolution was? I'll tell you if you want to hear what it was. It basically said this has been a horrible war. It's time for it to end. The job of the UN is to bring about peace in the world. I thought that's what the UN was created to do, to stop wars and to prevent them. And that's what the resolution did. Was it antagonistic towards the Russians? No. Back to the point. But it also didn't praise the Russians. All it said is, this is a bad war. It needs to end. And by the way, at the Security Council, which has not been widely reported, the first resolution on Ukraine that has passed the Security Council in 3 years, passed this week because of the leadership of President Trump, and it's a resolution that says, bad war needs to end, let's bring the two sides together. That's what the resolution is. Again, what is the United Nations for? Isn't it not a forum to promote peace in the world? And shouldn't our president, shouldn't we all be happy that we have a president who's trying to stop wars and prevent them instead of start them? And I just don't get it. I really don't, other than the fact that it's Donald J. Trump. If this was a Democrat that was doing this, everyone would be saying, well, he's on his way to the Nobel Peace Prize. This is absurd. We are trying to end a war. You cannot end a war unless both sides come to the table, starting with the Russians. And that is the point the president has made. And we have to do whatever we can to try to bring them to the table to see if it's even possible. I'm not promising you it's possible. I'm not telling you it's 90% likely. I'm saying it's 0% likely if we don't get them to a negotiating table. And the sooner everyone grows up around here and figures out that this is a bad war that's heading in a bad direction with death and destruction and all kinds of dangers surrounding it that could spiral into a broader conflict, the sooner people grow up and realize that, I think the more progress we're going to be able to make. But the president's crystal clear. He campaigned on it, and he's going to govern on it. And that is, he is going to be a president that tries to achieve peace, and he has been very clear this is a war that would have never happened had Donald Trump been in the White House, and it needs to end, and we're going to do everything we can to end it in an enduring and sustainable and fair way.
You said in your confirmation hearings that Russia will have to make concessions to get a peace deal. What concessions do you expect them to make?
Well, why would I say that on a news broadcast? That's what negotiations are about. That's the problem here. Again, this is not a messaging exercise, okay? This is, can they get to a table? And then there's hard work to be done. You're absolutely right. I'm not telling you this is an easy peace deal. The Russians will give you a 30-minute lecture on the history of Ukraine and this, that, and the other. The Ukrainians have their own point of view. There's no doubt about it. But what peace deal in the history of the world has ever been easy? That's the hard work of diplomacy. That's exactly what the vice president was alluding to. That's what peace deals involve. You've covered this. You've been around for a long time. These conflicts are not easy to solve. But you can't solve them at all if you don't even have a process to try to solve it, if you don't have the parties at the table. And right now, that's been our goal. It's been explained crystal clear to the Ukrainians and the Europeans and everyone else who wants to know for weeks now. For weeks now. And the only thing they were told is, do not do things to derail it. And sadly, President Zelenskyy, couldn't contain himself in that regard. I hope this could all be reset. I hope he comes to the realization that we're actually trying to help his country here before it suffers thousands of more casualties. 3 million people have already left Ukraine. Are they ever going to be able to come back? He's got Ukrainians being held prisoner, including children, on the Russian side. Why is any of this good for anybody? And the argument that we're going to just keep it going forever, that's absurd. So it's time to bring the Russians to the table, if it's even possible, and see if there's a way forward that ends this conflict and makes sure it never happens again. That's our goal. That remains our goal. That's the president's goal.
Yeah. So you seen that, you heard that. Marco Rubio basically said, listen, Zelenskyy ain't got nothing. Right? Which is right? He doesn't have anything at this point. Okay? His women have left. They've gone on, right? They can now, go over wherever they want to go because they're seen as refugees, right? They definitely not coming back into a war-torn country. So the women are gone. The men that basically don't want to fight, they're gone, and they can't come back because they're seen as basically traitors. The men that are there, they're dying, right? So again, what does Zelenskyy have outside of the United States continue to give him money, right? He ain't really got that much going for him. So at the end of the day, I feel like if you actually care about Ukraine more so than killing Russians, then, hey, you should be pro-peace, right? But a lot of these people are not pro-peace because they see the Ukrainians as the sacrificial lambs to fight Putin, right? And to, quote unquote, prevent Putin from expanding westward. But again, I just don't think that is realistic. I really don't. I think ultimately at the end of the day, if peace is not achieved, it's going to be a worse outcome from Ukraine. It could get nuclear. I don't know. Right. But I don't think that Putin is going to allow himself to, quote unquote, lose, okay, without using nukes. And that's not a place that anybody wants to be. Right. And I think that we can come to a long-term peace agreement, if all parties are willing to come to the table in an honest way, okay, in good faith and negotiate. But right now we have at least one party, right, and maybe two, okay, in Europe and Ukraine that don't want to participate in good faith negotiations, and that's the problem. That's the problem. But again, they'll point at everybody else and say, oh, you're the bad guy. You're the bad guy for wanting Ukraine to survive, right? Again, that's the crazy part about this. So, hey, Marco Rubio, good job. JD Vance as well, too. Again, I got to point this out because I think this is just something that people need to keep in mind. Marco Rubio used to be a neocon, okay? He also used to be against Trump. Same thing with JD Vance, except I don't think JD Vance ever really was a neocon, but he used to be against Trump as well, too. And this is what I try to tell you guys about people like Marco Rubio and JD Vance. Sometimes your former enemies can be your best allies, right? Because they know what it's like to be your enemy, right? They don't want to be your enemy anymore. So they're essentially going to be loyal to you due to the fact that they know what it's like to be your enemy. And I think that's kind of what happened with JD Vance and Marco Rubio, and that's why they're some of President Trump's strongest allies and supporters now, just due to the fact that they know what it's like to be against President Trump. And it's a very remarkable thing to see. But let me know what you guys think. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, share a Black conservative perspective. Peace.